For those of us who, like me, have never served even a minute in a jail or prison, and who may be squeamish about people who have, it is worth considering the names of some of those who have been incarcerated. Francis David, who is the first Unitarian minister, arguably, in history, living in 16th century Transylvania, also one of the first champions of freedom of religious belief when intolerance was rife all around the rest of Europe. Protestants, Catholics, at each other's throats. Also in prison, an American, Henry David Thoreau, a British, Bertrand Russell, Margaret Sanger, Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Father Daniel Berrigan, Reverend Peter Morales. These names, I'd say, speak for themselves. Yet I know personally, from the testimony of a few people who have served a day or more in jail, less famous than those persons I just mentioned, that imprisonment can be an intolerable, brutalizing experience, devoid of redeeming aspects, not calculated towards making a person rehabilitated. I remember hearing, for example, from one personal friend who years ago had been in a local detention center, though not charged with any crime. The arresting officers just didn't like males with long hair. So they rounded up my friend, and he certainly qualified for long hair, and his companions. They were sitting in a park, minding their own business in that community, which happened to be Reno, Nevada, and they were busted. And my friend and others found themselves in a hot, cramped, miserable detention facility. But the worst of it is they had no idea how long they might be there. It could well have been much longer, but for the efforts of a lone wolf American Civil Liberties Union lawyer, who had been phoned, by the way, by none other than my father, and all of them were released. But my friend told me there was nothing positive in that jail experience, brief and uncomfortable as it was. And of course, others are detained without any charge for much longer. And for many of them, their only trespass is they don't have enough money to pay the bail. That's the way it was for the late Khalif Brawler, placed in Rikers prison at the age of 16 for allegedly stealing a backpack, something that he said he never did and for which he was acquitted. But not until he had spent 3 years at Rikers, with his family not able to afford the $3,000 for bail. The accuser, by the way, had changed his story at least once, said Khalif stole it a few minutes earlier, then said no, it was 2 weeks earlier. Khalif in prison was subjected to beatings by inmates, by staff, and he spent 2 of those 3 years in solitary confinement, maintaining his innocence all along, but not his hope. He tried suicide twice in prison. Last week, unable to rid himself of the demons, even though he was released, he succeeded. He killed himself. Prison crushes spirits, eliminates hope, leaves people more bitter and less able to cope than before they were put behind bars. You might recall a number of years ago, actually it was in 1971, an experiment at Stanford University in which a mock prison was set up on the campus for 7 to 14 days. One group of students were assigned to be guards, one group to be inmates. The experiment had to be stopped early. Students who were assigned as guards had come to revel in their authoritarianism and even sadism. Students assigned as prisoners were literally beginning to break down emotionally. And it took a while for the person who was handling the experiment to say, come out, this is not part of the experiment anymore. This is over, this experiment is over. So couple the psychological toll of imprisonment with this other fact. Inmates, upon release, are often unable to find employment, or public housing, or public benefits, or professional therapeutic assistance, or the right to vote. As soon as one experienced the initial bewildering news that one is having the prison gate locked behind one, and you're now out in the open free, one prisoner put it, but then I realized I don't have any food, I don't have clothes, I don't have transportation. What am I to do? It's small wonder that many of them find themselves right back in prison. The warden of Louisville, Kentucky's prison, Mark Holden, said, "This system doesn't work. If you try the same thing over and over and get this and expect different results, that's the definition of insanity." And he is joined in that view not only by people on the liberal left, but increasingly individuals on the right side of the political spectrum, that is, conservative side. We already have Bernard Carrick's view to that effect, and perhaps there's just nothing like a prison term to make somebody into a prison reformer. But he's joined by the likes of Rick Perry, governor of Texas, Grover Norquist, the one who doesn't want taxes for programs that provide domestic benefits to people, Newt Gingrich, all calling for alternatives to incarceration for nonviolent, drug-related offenses in the main. If our prison system is a calamitous failure, it certainly is an enormously costly one. Do you know how much it costs to lock someone up at Rikers per year? $168,000. That same person could be put up in the Waldorf Astoria in New York City with complete room service for less cost. Or enrolled at Yale University, all expenses paid. We spend $50 million a year locking up juveniles, most of whom have never committed a violent offense. But I also know a psychiatrist who told me there are more people suffering schizophrenia in prison than there are in hospitals. I mentioned the Louisville warden already. He's featured in a program that Channel 13, well, it's Channel 13 in New York, public television's Frontline program, focused on the warden in Louisville, Kentucky. He said that one prisoner in the penitentiary of which he was supervisor, diagnosed with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, had already cost the taxpayers $1.1 million, that one person. We have today 2,300,000 people in the prisons and jails of this country. The United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world, greater than China's. greater than Iran's. We only have 5% of the world's population, but we have almost 25% of the world's prisoners. Now consider that 45 years ago, in the mid-1970s, there was less than a seventh that prison population. Why this tremendous surge of people in prison in this country? The figures are all the more puzzling when you consider that our country has not had an exceptionally high or growing violent crime rate over that period. American official crime rates are roughly equivalent to Finland's and Germany's. But Germany's imprisonment rate remained during the same 30-year span about the same. And Finland's went down 60%. Ours went stratospheric. Why? One answer is that more than half of the incarcerated population in this country are in prison for nonviolent crimes, often possession and use of illegal substances. Some think that those in prison for drug offenses are big-time dealers, kingpins. That's not the case. As Michelle Alexander points out in her remarkable and well-documented book, The New Jim Crow, the majority of drug arrests over the past 3.5 decades have been for simple possession of a controlled substance. Very often, that controlled substance has been marijuana. Two other authorities on the matter, Mark Maurer, Ryan King, in their book, The 25-Year Quagmire, say that the majority of those in prison for drug offenses have no history of significant sales activity or violence. During the 1990s, marijuana possession accounted for 80% of the increase in prison convictions. Now, I know of people, and so do you, who admit to having possessed or smoked marijuana. Maybe like President Bill Clinton, they didn't inhale. There are many others who don't talk about it. What's important is that if your experience is anything like mine, many of those same people are leading constructive, decent, law-abiding lives. And apparently much of the public is increasingly feeling that sheer possession or use of marijuana does not preclude being a responsible human being and member of our society. That's what the voters said recently in Colorado and Washington. And yet many, most especially people of color, sit for months or years in tiny stone cells behind heavy locks and ribbon barbed wire for exactly that behavior, use of marijuana. And I don't say people of color flippantly or unadvisedly. Whites and blacks sell illegal drugs at similar rates, around 6.5% of the population, according to the United States Department of Health and Human Services. But Human Rights Watch has concluded that black men have been admitted to prison on drug charges 20 to 50 times the rate of white men. Race is an enormous factor when considering the burgeoning numbers of people behind bars in the United States. There's a larger percentage of the black population in prison in this country than there was in South Africa when apartheid was at its height. Look at Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. 3 out of 4 black men in that city can expect to spend time in jail or prison. And in the poorest neighborhoods of the district, nearly all the black male residents. And Washington, D.C.'s example is repeated in cities throughout America, in Chicago, with its history of an African-American mayor, and an African-American chief of police, and an African-American president of the United States. The number of black males with felony records is equal to 80% of the entire adult black male force in the Chicago area. And when one is convicted, one is often considered a felon, and make no mistake about it, being a felon stigmatizes one for life. Let's humanize the matter a little bit. I'd like to talk about Demetria. Demetria is 15 years old, lives in Louisville, Kentucky. She grew up in a housing project, Beecher Terrace, a few blocks from the nearest prison. And people were arrested and sent to that jail constantly from Beecher Terrace. Her uncle, her cousins, and her father were all in jail. In fact, she never knew her father. Her mother was shot and killed when Demetria was 9 years old. She lives with an aunt with whom she doesn't get along. Demetria has spent over a year in prison already, and her crime was truancy from school. I teach at the college level, and there are students who are truant from class, and that's not good. Should they be in prison for that behavior? Demetria has an anxiety disorder, but she's not inarticulate. She told the television interviewer, "Being locked up doesn't do me any good. It just makes me more mad." She asked for a special pass to her visit her mother's grave on the birthday of her mother, transported by her aunt. Her aunt never showed up to pick her up. What is the answer? And I say this struggling with it in my immediate family, I must confess. For young people with more than minor psychological issues and acting out, I think it's a kind of facility that is supervised, but which offers youth an opportunity for therapy, for developing skills, for developing relationships with people of their own age who are struggling with personal psychological issues as well. And drug and narcotics rehabilitation. We would save so much money doing it that way. And that's why these more conservative political officials are realizing the fact that the states and the federal government can't afford imprisonment. But more important is the cost in human lives. What is the worst of the worst? It's something called solitary confinement. You've heard on the news a man who was in solitary confinement in Louisiana for 42 years. I already mentioned the terrible story of Khalif Browler. There was another suicide last week of someone who was in solitary. But I also want to mention Johnny Perez. Johnny Perez has been out of prison for 21 months. He was one of the speakers at this past April's Unitarian Universalist United Nations Office Spring Seminar. He's poised and articulate, but what's important is even as a former resident of solitary confinement, he is doing something meaningful now with his life, helping other people re-enter society safely and with some employment, working at a place called the Urban Justice Center. I asked him after he spoke, what gave you any morsel of hope? What gave you the confidence to develop yourself in a tiny box for 22 hours a day, day after day, week after week? And he said there was one book lying around on the table in the prison, War and Peace, and he read it. And he began to self-educate. And he's lit a candle. We do not need solely to curse the darkness. There's a bill in the New Jersey legislature sponsored by Senator Raymond Lesniak, a Democrat of Union, New Jersey, requiring a hearing within 72 hours whenever anyone is placed in solitary confinement in this state. After 2 weeks, the UN has declared that it's considered torture. I'm not saying that everyone in prison should be released. There are people there who've demonstrated they are dangerous and have committed gruesome crimes to prove it. That includes those 2 who escaped the maximum security prison in upstate New York, each of whom dismembered a body after killing the person. But these people represent 13% of the prison population. 87% are in for essentially nonviolent offenses, bad checks, not reporting income for taxes, possessing illegal drugs. And many of them are there with mental health problems that are not adequately treated. There is some good news. I mentioned the Louisville, Kentucky case covered on public television. A bill passed 5 years ago in Kentucky to place nonviolent drug offenders in treatment facilities rather than prison. By 2 years ago, there were already 1,300 fewer inmates in Louisville. 3 jails were closed. The bill will save, potentially, Kentucky $500 million in tax money in the current decade. Locking up people who fail to pay traffic fines, who have small amounts of marijuana, who are mentally ill, doesn't work, said Mark Bolton, Department of Corrections chief in Louisville. Similar success has been reported in the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. That was described in a recent New Yorker article. What am I saying? For hundreds of thousands of nonviolent offenders put in cages, we who are our brothers and sisters keepers have a better way. Yes, people have not done what they ought to have done and done what they ought not to have done, and there should be consequences. But those people, 87% of the prison population, are not murderers. They're not armed robbers. And we have seen they can be pushed with the proper kind of professional intervention toward a responsible, rewarding life for the sake of us all. It can happen. We have seen it happen already. We believe in the worth and dignity of every person. It is a sacred value in our little list of purposes and principles. To act on that value, I believe we must not resort to imprisonment as a kind of panacea that is false. For those who are mentally ill, chemically dependent, in possession of marijuana, or truant from school, or otherwise nonviolent in their trespass. There is a better way, and do better. We can and we must. Thank you. Would you turn with me to